Before we begin, we'd like to take a minute and say that this episode is brought to you by DC Muslim Youth and Adams Fairfax. So, thank you for joining us. Before we get started, we have a little bit of an icebreaker that the previous guest is asking you without knowing it was you. And at the end, you'll pick the icebreaker for the next question, for the next guest, as well as answer that question at the end.
Without knowing them.
Without knowing them. You'll have to wait as well as
how personal can this icebreaker get?
I mean, so it's a list of questions, but if you have a question that you want to ask them,
okay,
then you can do it, and then.
So I can't be like, well, who's your 5th grade crush?
You can ask it. We can do both.
And then it turns out to be Imam Majid.
Oh wow, yeah, that was gonna be a little bit tough. But no, you can ask it. I'll talk to them before we record the episode. I'll be like, oh, do you wanna answer that question, or do you wanna answer the pre-selected question? But yeah, no. When we get there, we can discuss that.
Okay.
But the question for you, the icebreaker question is, what's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Best piece of advice I've ever received. I've received so much advice, it's hard to pin it down.
What's the first one that comes to your mind?
First one that comes to mind.
When I ask that question.
All right, ask it again.
What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Sleep well.
Sleep well?
It's the best. Yeah. My mom always used to say that, sleep well, which is very ironic because my mom sleeps about 5 hours a night.
Oh, wow.
And she's like 70 and she still sleeps 5 hours a night. But my mom used to say that all the time, sleep well. And, when you're a young guy like you, 18, you can sleep as much as you want, 3 hours, and then you just guzzle some coffee and you keep going.
Or Red Bull.
Or Red Bull, exactly, right? You have Red Bull at my age, and you're not sleeping until the next night. The problem is that the older you get, right, the more difficult it is for your body to keep up with the demands on it. And the most important part, there's 3 things that you absolutely need to do constantly in order for your body to be able to maintain itself as a proper functioning. And that is you need to eat well, you need to sleep well, and you need to have activity. Mm-hmm. Constant activity. I do none of the 3. And yet somehow I still survive.
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah, right? But the problem is I don't know how much longer I can keep that going. The longer that I continue with this kind of lifestyle, the more likely it is that I crash and burn at some point.
I think that kind of comes with everything. When you do everything wrong for an extended period of time, at some point it's all gonna just if you bottle up your emotions for an extended period of time, it's gonna be a breaking point where it's just break down, you go crazy, and it's just gonna.
Oh, bro, you're not on the stoicism bandwagon.
No, I'm not.
You just have to hold it all in. And go,
I don't think that works.
Yeah, it don't work.
It really doesn't.
A lot of the Stoic philosophers all committed to a lot of them committed suicide.
Oh, really?
And for good reason. I mean, it's all just kind of
holding everything in.
Some of them went mad. Some of them committed suicide. Everybody points to Marcus Aurelius, but he was more of one. It was Marcus Aurelius.
Yeah.
And 2, he was more of an outlier.
Interesting. Yeah, Stoicism. I've seen a lot of a lot of videos about it come up on my Instagram feed, and I'm like, is this something that I want to do? Is this something that I truly believe in? And I'm like, nah. It's it's too much at some point. It's there's a level of where you have to kind of just keep it in, hold it in, and kind of move on with your day. But there should be some times when you can kind of put down the guards with the people that you love, and just kind of allow yourself to recharge and vent.
Yeah, one of the things that I find very interesting is one of the pillars of Stoicism is renunciation. In fact, Stoicism becomes very important in a lot of Gnostic and a lot of spiritual movements, both in Christianity and in Islam. In fact, you can look at a lot of the later Sufis as Islamizing a lot of Stoicism. But one of the major aspects of Stoicism is to not let your desires be in control of you. And so,
or your emotions, right?
It starts with your emotions.
Yeah.
It's anything that can have control over you should not have control over you. And so one of the major elements to that is the idea of pleasures not having control over you. But if you look at the group of people who've kind of weaponized Stoicism these days, right? It's all about the pleasurable life.
Yeah.
It's all about the pleasurable life. So it's a certain kind of Stoic image that they want to take on for themselves. Mm-hmm. But they don't actually want to buy into the entire philosophy of Stoicism, because Stoicism as a philosophy is the idea that the rational mind is the most important part of the human being.
Yeah.
Right? It's very Greek in that sense, because the Greeks have almost a disdain for emotion and for anything that's not rational.
Yeah.
And so the Stoics, for them, the rational mind is one of the most important elements of, it's probably the most important element of being human, right? When Aristotle defines a human, he defines him as a reasoning animal.
Yeah.
Right? And so there's this idea that there are certain things in the human being that overpower the ability of the mind to reason. One of them is definitely emotion, but the other one is desire. And so the way the Stoics kind of see the human as overcoming anything that is non-human about him. If rationality is what makes you human, then the rest of it is what makes you animal. So
like the emotion and
exactly
the actual human part.
Exactly. what we would consider like, this is kind of what makes you human. But for them, it's like if reason makes you human, then everything that is not reason makes you animal. And so you have to find a way to bring your reason to control them. And that is the core of Stoic philosophy. So your emotions, you bring your reason to rule over your emotions. Your desire, you bring your reason to rule over your desire. Because I mean, you look at desire, like food, intimacy, all these type of things. A dog wants that, right? There's nothing special about human, but the human is the only one who can control it with his reason, right? But the Stoics kind of take it the whole like end, which is like, you have to dominate it. Exactly.
I think that's a lot with a lot of stuff nowadays, especially, and again through history. But nowadays, everything's like one extreme or the other. If you don't fall in either, you're kind of like you're not necessarily not accepted, but your voice isn't heard.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? And I think that's what Islam is. Islam is that balance where it's like it does get taken to an extreme on both ends, but real Islam, in my opinion, from my understanding, is having that balance of like just life, work, your faith, believing in God, having that tawakkul in Allah, but at the same time doing what you have to do as human. You know what I mean? Like not like sitting home and not working and expecting Allah will give you food. You know what I mean? It's more of like you have to go out, you have to put the work in, you have to kind of like be human, and then everything else falls to Allah.
My rule of thumb is, if your philosophy can't make sense of the life of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Sahaba, your philosophy is nonsense. And so a lot of this kind of Stoic stuff, it can make sense of certain sayings of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but it can't make sense of the entirety of his life. Yeah. Right. And if you look at the entirety of the life of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there were times he cried and there were times he laughed. There was times that he was emotional. There were times where he wasn't emotional. A man came to the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He just sent him to do like a big job, and he comes back. And the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he asked Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who's the most beloved person to you? And he says, Aisha. Yeah. Anha. And so he's like, no, from the men. He says, her father. Right. This kind of they used to wait for the day where the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam would go to visit Aisha and Anha to ask him for for anything they wanted. Yeah. Because that was the time he was happiest. Yeah. Right. There are many parts of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam's life. And if your philosophy can't make sense of all of the parts, not some of them, all of them,
working hand in hand,
exactly,
it's wrong.
And it's wrong. It's nonsense.
That's what Islam is.
Yeah, exactly.
If you brought down Islam, and that's like it kind of brings everything together.
Well, I mean, this is the thing: is that okay? So we say that this is Islam, but there's many ways of understanding Islam, right? There anything. Any theory that can make sense of all of the sacred texts of Islam is Islamic. But just because you have this theory that makes sense of them in this way doesn't mean that another theory is not going to come and make sense of it another way. A lot of it has to do with interpretation, and you're boxed in that interpretation by two things: by the text and the language. So there are definitely like when we say there's two ways to go extreme on this. There's like one way of saying there's only one in Islam and everybody has to follow this one Islam. The other extreme is like, oh, what is Islam? But like interpretation and human. Both of them are nonsense. Anything that is Islam, right, is it takes all of the data and it puts it through an interpretive lens, and you get a theory. Yeah. And that theory is Islamic, right? even if there are like 3 or 4 theories that are in tension with each other, they can all still be simultaneously Islamic, because what is it realistically? What you have to do in order to be within the realm of Islam is you have to take seriously as true all sacred text. That's the acts. That's the Rasul the Sunnah of the Rasul, the Quran, the actions of the Sahaba, like all of these major sacred texts.
Yeah.
And it has to make sense of them in such a way that they're not contradictory. And it has to make sense of them in such a way that you're not discounting the language entirely. So, when Allah says, Aqim as-salah, you're like, salah, does it really mean prayer? Or does it mean like a connection with God, So as long as you're not like being really loosey-goosey with the language, and you're not discounting any of the sacred texts, and you make an interpretation, that's Islamic.
Yeah. I'm guessing you learned this in, this is not necessarily linked with your PhD program, but I think that's a good direction to go. How's that journey been, getting your PhD in
It's so
studies?
Boring.
Is it?
It's so boring. Within one semester, I was like, I'm done.
Really?
I came home, I sat with my mom, and I was depressed.
Oh, wow.
Because I had spent years like prepping myself to like put in an application. And then like at the beginning of my second semester, I came home and I sat down and I was depressed.
Oh, wow.
And she's like, what's wrong? I was like, this is all nonsense. And she's like, well, why did you start it in the first place? I was like, Mom, I gotta get the doctor title. I was like, I have to be doctor.
I didn't go into medicine, but I'm gonna get my PhD.
Exactly. I can give prescriptions of books.
Yeah.
But I realistically, the way that the Muslim community functions is you have a kind of like a schizophrenia in the Muslim community. Part of it is if they look at the Mufti title, that is you don't need anything else to be able to have authority amongst Muslims. And there's another part that looks at the Muftis and goes, Mufti. There's another side that if you have a doctor title, that's all you need to be authoritative to it.
Yeah.
And the other side looks at doctor, right? But realistically, you cannot bring Islam into proper understanding and function to this world until you do 2 things. Until you understand the tradition of Islam itself. And the tradition is too vast, so you have to understand like a portion of it very, very, very well. And the other is you need to understand the modern world very well. And there's a third thing I would bring in, which is you have to understand the difference between the historical Muslim world and the modern world, the difference in all of its systems. And then you can get to a point where you're like, okay, now I can be in conversation about how to bring Islam, the tradition of Islam, understanding of these texts, into conversation with how to live Islam in modernity. And so you need both a grounding in the Islamic tradition and the modern world, the understanding of the modern world. Being a mufti will give you an understanding of a certain amount of understanding of a certain kind of Islamic tradition.
Yeah.
And being a doctor, like Dr. So-and-so, will give you a pretty good understanding of how the modern world functions. But the reason why I chose Islamic studies is because Islamic studies is it's not like I don't know, like psychology or history or whatnot. It's a very focused kind of idea of what it does. Islamic studies is like, well, this is kind of Islamic. Let's study it.
Yeah.
So you can do it in history, you can do it in theology, you can do it in philosophy, you can do it in law, you can do it in
stoic aspects.
Yeah, exactly. Islamic Stoicism. Yeah. You can take whatever you want. That is just somehow tangentially related to some kind of study of Islam, and do it in Islamic studies.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's always been a kind of Islam and modernity type thing, where you look at the theories of Islamic modernity and go in that direction, and then be able to bring a lot of things into conversation.
Yeah.
I think one of the dissatisfactions I have with the way that the modern field kind of, or the lay of the land is right now, is you have a certain amount of people who hate the modern, and they're like in love with the pre-modern, in love with the pre-modern. They're just
Yeah.
always like, you know, if they're like, we should just destroy everything that exists now and go back to going to the bathroom in a field.
Yeah.
Right.
On that little
Exactly
hole in the ground.
in the pot. You know,
Yeah.
peeing in the pot. And then there's another group of people who are like, oh, everything in the past sucked, and we have to think about the modern.
Yeah.
It's a lot more difficult to think about how, in very many ways, the modern world as it exists today is very much built on Islamic principles.
Mm-hmm.
And is built on principles that are not just un-Islamic, they're predatory towards Islam itself.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, understanding the past is never coming back. And you have to find a way to bring the principles of the past into conversation with the reality of today.
Yeah.
And build towards a future in which the world itself is not built on principles that are predatory to Islam,
Yeah.
but are coming out of the tradition itself.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very difficult task.
What do you think of the book Al-Halal Wal-Haram by Yusuf Al-Qaradawi? I think...
Qaradawi?
Yeah.
Qaradawi is an interesting person. Qaradawi is... Allah yarhamu rahimahullah. Sheikh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi is... he has a lot of projects, right? But this is not a project for one person.
Yeah.
Like, this is not a project where, like, you know, you're going to have, like it's not like, you know, everybody's going to be like some kind of anime thing where, like, everybody's, like, sitting defeated, and then, like, the sky opens and somebody, like, descends from the sky and there's, like, angels in the background.
Yeah.
Oh, you know, like, that's not how this is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be a cumulative building project.
Yeah.
Where it's a lot of people that are going to be doing it together.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, Sheikh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi makes important contributions, but he's not like, that's not like the only thing, right? There's a lot of people who make very important contributions. The person that I'm studying, Muhammad Iqbal, he makes very important contributions. Taha Abdul Rahman makes very important contributions. Even non-Muslims like Wal Halaq make important contributions. But this is not something that... Two things are very important in this. This is not something that happens by one person or even a small group of people. It's a societal project. It's a civilizational project. Yeah. And the second thing that's very important to it is the Muslim modernity is not possible without Muslim power. And until you have sovereign Muslim states that can govern themselves without fear or being beholden to non-Muslim states for their proper function, you will not be able to have Muslim modernity.
Interesting. I think that's a very good take. And you said Muhammad Iqbal, and
yes,
at a lot of the events that I come to with Kafa specifically, you always quote his poetry. So if we could dive a little bit deeper into that, I know you're very into poetry. You were an English major, I believe.
I was
an
English major,
out of college, like your bachelor's.
Yeah.
How was that? Like, why poetry, really? Because that for me is just like.
I always say this. I met this young man. He was like, "Oh, I'm really into poetry these days. I've taken up poetry." And I said to him, "Nobody takes up poetry. They're driven to it. Poetry. What differentiates poetry from prose is that prose is a very rational exploration of what it means to be human, and poetry is a almost entirely emotive exploration of what it means to be human. Poetry is pure emotion. Pure emotion. That's why the best poetry is the one that makes you go,
and tingles on you, right?
Exactly, right? And that it's not like, oh, that was a very interesting thought. It has really opened my mind to it hits. Yeah. It hits at a place that, like, the mind that the mind can't go. It hits at a place that only the heart knows. And that's kind of how poetry functions. Yeah. So I was always a prose writer. I was always short fiction, novels, essays, that type of thing. But eventually, I was also driven to poetry. And once you get driven to poetry, you realize it comes in tandem with an exploration of your own emotional state. But you realize very quickly that there's so much more to being human than just being rational. Yeah. That the majority of the human being is within their kind of emotionality, and that the reason is kind of even reason is coming out of that emotional state.
Yeah.
But one of the people who really brings that kind of reason and emotion into conversation is very much Iqbal, and he does it in a a little bit background on Iqbal. Iqbal, born in 1877. He was born in British India, about 19 years after the what was called the Sepoy Mutiny. The Sepoy Mutiny was a major rebellion against the British in 1857, 1858. Before that, the British ruled India from about 1800 onwards. Nobody, like from 1799, nobody was actually an independent state outside of the British. But it wasn't ruled by the British Empire proper. It was ruled by the East Indian Company. And then there's this massive rebellion in 57 and 58. The Brits put down the rebellion, and then power is transferred from the East Indian Company to the British Empire proper.
Yeah.
And so Iqbal is born in 1877, which is about 19 years after the put down the mutiny, 20 years after its beginning. And he is dealing with a very important question. And it's not just being Muslim is seen as a problem, right? Because you can have a lot of identity Muslims where it's like, I'm Muslim, I wear the hijab and I would club, right? That type of thing. But where the very precepts of Islam, the very moral values of Islam, the entire worldview, the cosmology of Islam, we start from a God-centered lens. All of that is seen as a problem. And the Muslim not only is that seen as a problem, but it is imposed and upheld by powers who can only uphold their power with the subjugation of those who are not them. And so not only is Islam seen as a problem, but any attempt to make Islam seem coherent is seen as a challenge to world authority. And so you are simultaneously seen as a problem and a threat. Because you can see a problem that's not a threat, and you can see a threat that's not a problem.
Yeah.
And so you are seen simultaneously as a problem and a threat, and you're constantly preyed upon, both physically and civilizationally and intellectually. So, physically, you're jailed, you're killed, right? But
you're oppressed.
But intellectually and civilizationally is really far more where the violence is directed. And that is attempts to educate you out of Islam. To make your Islam seem unreasonable to you in ways that you grow up wanting to be Muslim, but not believing that it is reasonable.
There's so many rules and it's very strict. And
all of that stuff. But also, for example, if you go into the reason, you constantly hear, why is this halal? Why is this haram? Why is halal? Why is this haram? And it's not because a person doesn't want to be Muslim. It's because they've been educated in moral systems that exist outside of Islam, and now they have to justify their Islam within those moral systems. And in fact, there's a lot of really good literature on how this was not done accidentally. This was done very purposefully. Starting from 1830 something.
Oh wow.
The East Indian Company recognized that its major problem in India was that people were not accepting the superiority of the British because they were so deeply embedded in their own traditional systems. And so they started a public education program that far predates anything else. And the goal of this public education program was to de-Indianize
India,
and to secularize it, and to show them the superiority of the British and British ways.
Yeah.
This was not a accidental project. This was something very much that was it was planned, it was executed in a certain way, and there was a lot of pushback against it. So one of the biggest Muslim education systems in the world are the Deobandi madrasas. We have some in America too. You got Darul in Buffalo. You got some in Chicago. Darul Qasim in Chicago, for example. Right? These Deobandi madrasas. Realistically, the Deobandi madrasas are a pushback against this entire system. And in many ways, like, it begins as a kind of preservation project after the collapse of the Mughal Empire in '58. But what it really is an attempt to push back against the militant secularization and de-Indianization, de-Islamization of Muslims in India through the British education system. And in fact, the British push back against these very attempts to maintain Islam within people. Where, for example, the British make this rule that if you are not graduating from a British school or a British affiliated school, you can't get a job within the bureaucracy.
Oh, wow.
And because it destroyed the Indian economy, the best jobs were in the bureaucracy. So what they were basically saying was, if you don't come out of our system and are not de-Islamized, de-Indianized, and kind of self-hating, then you can't make money. So that same kind of thing persists today.
Yeah.
Like, the public education system in America is half a system of education, and the other half is a system of indoctrination. And so what you end up with, one of my friend of mine, I'm not sure if you know Mubin Vaid. Mubin is somebody asked Mubin, why shouldn't I send my kids to public school? You came out okay. He said, we survived the slaughter. And if you look at the way the public education system functions, right? Today we have the growing incursion of the Lagbatar, LGBTQ Lagbatar. So we have the growing incursion, and everybody suddenly seems to be like, oh, they're trying to indoctrinate our kid. Bro, they've been indoctrinating your kids from the beginning.
Yeah.
Okay? It's like from the very beginning they've been going at your kids.
And now it's just natural. Like, it started in the 1830s, right? And now it's just like,
now it's just a part of, like,
they don't necessarily meaning to do it, but it's like that's just how it is.
It's ingrained in the fabric of society.
Yeah.
That we have to educate our children in the moral values that are American, or the moral values that are, and our moral values are universally correct. So we have to educate them in the universally correct moral values.
Yeah.
Right.
Even though we use feet, and they use the rest of the world use meters.
I mean, in a sense, but you also have feet and meters and moral values.
Yeah.
So, for example, in America, hierarchy is seen as an immoral value. Like, the fact that I can say certain things to you, you can't say them back to me because you're 18 and I'm 34, right? That age hierarchy there is seen as almost immoral because we're humans.
Yeah.
If I go to Pakistan, the lack of that hierarchy is seen as immoral. Right? It's disrespect, and disrespect is immoral.
And then that's seen as like third world, or like they haven't modernized enough and things like that.
Exactly.
But just going back to when you were talking about the modernization of Islam and all that, and kind of like moving into it, like, because you can't really follow Islam as like it was followed back then, but you can't, like, you have to kind of like work with it, and kind of essentially grow with it. How do you do that with, like, because now we're saying that there's been this kind of movement, or this kind of societal move towards kind of burying Islam in a sense, and like westernizing it. How do you modernize without westernize? I think that's
bro, that's a very good question. So I'm
gonna get destroyed.
the real question is, you have to understand what is essentially Islam, and what was historically practiced as Islamic policy, as like policy of best implementing Islam in their time and place. In fiqh, we call this the thawabit and mutaghayyirat. The thawabit are those things that in time and place they don't change.
Yeah.
So, for example, prayer.
Yeah.
Whether you're in Antarctica, or you are in Virginia, or you're in Mecca, whether you're in the 6th century, whether you're in the 12th century, or whether in the 31st century. Fajr is 2 rakats.
Yeah.
Isha is 4 rakats. Maghrib is 3 rakats, etc. Right? These are thawabit. They're never changing. Now, what happens if you never see the sun? Right?
With people who are fasting, like in the
Exactly.
northern
Right?
hemisphere and stuff.
Like, what happens when if you never see the sun? Like in Antarctica, there's like months where they don't see the sun, right? And there's like a scientist who goes to study like the penguins or something in Antarctica, and they get there and they don't see the sun. That becomes a mutaghayyir. That's something that changes based on time and place.
Yeah.
So the asl never changes. The asl of XYZ never changes. Its practice and implementation can change based on a series of principles. The fact of the matter is that this is one of the reasons why we need a very nimble, highly trained, and intelligent scholarly class, because they need to be able to understand what is thabit and what is mutaghayyir. And how you negotiate the thawabit and the mutaghayyirat in the modern context. This is not a place for you and me to have discussions. It's not even a place for you and me to have opinions.
Yeah.
Because it requires so much advanced training and thought that you and I don't even know what we don't know.
Very true.
And so, like those are places where we need the scholarly class to be able to talk about that. And all we can talk about is, well, if you do this, the XYZ might be the result. We can't talk about the is this correct opinion or is it not correct opinion. We can only say if you do this, this will be the result.
Yeah.
Because we're smart enough to be like, if you ban cats, there'll be rats.
Yeah.
That type of thing. But we're not trained enough to actually be able to get to any of the opinions.
Yeah. Of course. So as we wrap up, I wanted to go a little bit into talk a little bit about mental health in Islam and how your journey's been with that and how you've kind of because yesterday at the Qahwa event you were talking about finding Allah through hardship, finding that love for Allah through hardship, and how Sister Ustad Al-Kawthar was also mentioning that how you don't really start loving Allah until you're kind of put in the position where you have to, and it kind of just comes to you. You just go a little bit more in just the mental health aspect and how it kind of balances with Islam.
So I'm not sure how much I should show behind the screen, but for me, mental health is my Trojan horse. I think it's important. I think it's important to talk to people about mental health, to make sure people are doing well, things like that. But for me, intellectually, it's my Trojan horse. What I mean by that is I'm not actually talking to you about mental health.
Yeah.
What I'm actually talking to you about is being secure in your faith in a world in which you will feel pain for it.
Yeah.
And I'm getting you to a point where you are comfortable with pain.
Yeah.
That's my real project with mental health. My real project with mental health is to get people ready to be Muslim in a world that hates Islam.
Yeah.
And still feel secure in it.
Be ready for the pain, because the pain will inevitably come.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That is my real project with mental health. And I will start with whatever painful experience you've had, and help you process it in a way that you are now comfortable with experiencing more difficulty. It's like it was the line that I quoted from Abu Aswad al-Du'ali, right? Which is a very powerful line. ووسع للأذى كثرة الأذى ووسع الصدر للأذى كثرة الأذى وقد كنت أحيانا يضيق به صدري. That the abundance of pain expanded my chest to pain, when before I used to sometimes my chest used to be constricted by pain. The idea is that the more you feel, the more you go through difficult experiences, and are able to process them in healthy ways, the more you're able to take on more difficult experiences. It doesn't scare you anymore. That's why I call myself an emotional linebacker. An emotional line, if you ever see a linebacker, by the way, the real football. If you ever see a linebacker,
careful, he's gonna. He's the soccer guy.
People ask me, what's your football team, and I say the Green Bay Packers. And they're like, Manchester United. I was like, no, let Manchester United come play on our turf, and we'll see who the real men. Okay, but if you ever see a linebacker tackling a running back, right? If me in my physical condition went and hit anybody with that level of thing, I'd be in the hospital for a week. Right? But a linebacker has trained their body to be able to go and just really that 20 mile an hour collision that takes somebody off their feet, right? That would send you and me to the hospital. A man gets back up, goes,
another one, let's
go, right? I'm an emotional linebacker, right? I take hits like that emotionally, and I'm right back up, and I'm going where other people be flat out, right? Not be able to move.
Because you condition yourself to...
Well, I haven't conditioned myself. Pain conditioned me, right? We need emotional linebackers in order to rebuild Islamic civilization. The reality is Islamic civilization doesn't build itself back 9 to 5. Islamic civilization doesn't build itself back by people who want comfortable lives. Islamic civilization doesn't build itself back by people who are scared of taking that punch, taking a hit. Islamic civilization only comes back when a person becomes an emotional linebacker. When a person is able to actually see themselves, when they see pain coming and they don't flinch, they hit it head on. So mental health is my Trojan horse. I am building people into becoming emotional linebackers so they can do the work for Islamic civilization.
That's beautiful. That's a very great answer. I never thought of it like that. So thank you for that. As we wrap up, we have this tradition, like I mentioned earlier, where you pick the question for the first question for the next guest. And if you'd like, you can also answer the question, but that's completely up to you. If you have a question that you want to ask, you can ask it, or not. If not, we'll do both. We'll pick a question from the list, and then you can also have your question, and I'll figure it out with the next guest. So you can pick a number between 1 and 47. Some of them are deeper questions, and some of them are more lighthearted. And then if you'd like to pick a question.
Between 1 and 47.
Yeah, a number. It
would have to be between 4 and 12 because 4 is Brett Favre and 12 is Aaron Rodgers. It could be 10. I'll go 10 because Jordan Love's a quarterback now.
10?
Yeah, and that's his number.
What's your favorite type of food?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah. Do you have any other question that you want to...
how many burgers is too many burgers?
How many okay. Let me write that down. How many burgers are too many burgers? Just in general, just not like for a party, just like one person. Just
open interpretation.
Okay. Perfect. So again, thank you for being here. If the audience hasn't learned anything, I know I have learned a lot. And again, like I mentioned, we could very much have many more conversations about more specific topics and kind of like have podcasts just more focused on so many different aspects of what we talked about today. But it was a pleasure having you here, and you guys, I guess, will have to wait until next week to figure out how many burgers is too many burgers. Again, episodes of Muslim Minds podcast are released every Thursday at 5 p.m. So we'll see you then, inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. If you're enjoying Muslim Minds and know someone else who might enjoy this as well, please take a moment and consider sharing this with them. That can either be through a link or telling them about this in person. By sharing, you'll help us inspire more Muslim youth out there. Also, if you're interested in being a guest or know someone who would be interested in being a guest, take a moment to DM us on Instagram at DC Muslim Youth or send us an email at social@dcmy.org. That's social@dcmy.org. Can't wait to hear from you, and thank you for listening.